Show.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to another edition of Office Hours. This is actually our 28th edition, our almost weekly. We've taken some weeks off. Last week, Friday, Office Hours was precluded by Eid, so we were celebrating the end of Ramadan. So we took a little bit of a holiday. But we're back now with a very special discussion streaming not only on Adnan Husain Show channel, but also East as a podcast, particularly because we have Sina Rahmani with us for our discussion, Unity in the Struggle Against Empire. Welcome, Sina. It's good to see you.
Hi, Adnan. I was thinking when you were talking, do you actually think that it's actually office hours and you have to be here every week?
Yeah,
it's just called office hours. You don't actually have to be there every week.
I shouldn't probably have called it that, because then I feel this oh my God, I have office hours. I have to be in the office. It's like that.
It's not a real office.
I know. But in any case, it's always good to be with people, and I do enjoy the kind of end of the week and a chance to kind of wrap and talk with a guest, sometimes just go off on my own, but usually a guest, and also to have some contact with the audience, people listening and watching live. And so do please like the stream right now. Those of you who are coming in, like the stream. That's a really easy thing to do. Share it on your social media. If you're watching on X, on my sort of account there, you can just retweet it. Very easy. And you can also subscribe to the channel if you're an East as a podcast watcher, listener, but you're on live now on that channel. You can kind of switch over and make sure to like and subscribe on mine, and then you can even go back if you want to go back to East as a podcast. And likewise for everybody who's watching on Adnan Husain Show, make sure, if you're not already a subscriber to Sina's channel, make sure to do that. Yeah, I see that, Dr. Roy Casagrande also had some show called Office Hours, and I don't necessarily encourage.
Don't bring this up to Adnan. Don't bring this up to Adnan. He's going to get mad.
Yeah, that's an annoyance. He's also, I think, not been very good, though I don't pay attention that much to what he does, but I saw something come on my feed that looked like he was debating on the Iran war and was taking some kind of position about how terrible the so-called regime is of the Islamic.
Oh no! Did he use the R word?
I don't. I didn't even watch it, but I could see from the description that he was on that side, or at least the frame.
Not you too, Roy Casablanca.
Oh well, I'm not sure why anybody had big expectations there, but okay, But in any case, I do want to also say that we typically do a fundraiser. We started doing the Ramadan Iftar campaign for the Samir Project, and we're going to continue now that kind of appeal is over, of course, to always encourage you to support the Samir Project, a great mutual aid organization operating in Gaza, particularly northern Gaza. But we did want to highlight and, start bringing some attention to other campaigns as well. And the first one that I want to raise, that I will be talking about in subsequent weeks, is the special online, small private online courses is a thing, right? Is like some universities offer these as part of their extension or outreach or para-curricular kind of short courses and things that aren't part of their normal curricular offerings, very often that students organize. Well, graduate students in particular at MIT, started a program last year to offer special small private online courses for students and people in Gaza who wanted to continue their education. As you know, the genocide has been targeted not only at the killing and slaughter of civilians, but also at the destruction of the institutions and infrastructure of civilian, educational, and social life, municipal services, and that scholasticide is something that has absolutely devastated the entire higher education system. Well, the entire education system from primary school, secondary school to the universities. And so I will be offering a course called Guerrilla History. All of you should know that I have another podcast that I'm a co-host of that's been going on for a long time. Co-host of Guerrilla History, teaching a course on that's called Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance Theory, History, and Practice, something like that. At any rate, it's going to be offered this summer for Gazan students. And in order for them to be able to participate, we need to fundraise for internet access so that they can, have online capabilities to participate in this course that I'm offering, for them. And so I've put the link in the chat. Support a third round of Spox for Gaza. This is the third time they're offering these courses, and they need to raise some money. So please be generous, and I will tell you more about it and the course in the future. But because Sina also fundraises for people in Gaza, I want to turn it over to him so that he can add a particular appeal for a fundraiser he's been dedicating his channel and support to. Go ahead, Sina.
Thank you, Adnan, and thank you for your work highlighting these things. You've been really good about bringing this more to the front. I should be more diligent, and I made a point. I said, let's do some fundraising on this week's stream. But yeah, as many of you know, I have been fundraising for my friend Mohammed, his family. As you know, you could probably all tell, right? This war has distracted a lot of people from Gaza, especially given that like the crises are piling up, Lebanon. So it's not but at the same time, the genocide is still ongoing. So I ask you, friends, to help Mohammed out. They were having a hard time paying their rent. And let's just get them, let's all of us who are here, or, give them something. Let's get them through like a month or something. Let's get them through a few weeks. Let's get a bunch of cash to them, and it'll help. And, that's all we can do. This is all we can do. This is one of the most, these people suffered like a Holocaust, like an actual live Holocaust. We watched it. We're all traumatized just having watched it. Imagine what it's like for them to have gone through it and survived it. So it hurts me. It hurts me to even think about like what we've done. Thank you so much for donating, Speedy Bozo. It's funny, people's names. But yeah, so I appreciate that, Adnan. I appreciate you, and I appreciate everyone in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and it's great to have people in. I see some, repeat offenders, but also some new people who I know of in Europe who are like Abraham Zevuster or Abram Zevuster, saying it's a good time for Europe. So maybe we might think about, moving to a 4. We've been, flexible in changing it, but if this is a good time, why not knock off work at 4? You don't have to work to 5 on the East Coast. Like, just let's all take it easy at the end of the day, and make it easier for our comrades and friends to join maybe in Europe. So we'll look into that. But I wanted to talk with you a little bit more, Sina, about this subject that I'm going to be. It's the kind of subject we're thinking about all the time, but sometimes we use the terms without really going into excavating, how empire and imperialism work, what they are, how we, and this kind of an analysis is, of course, needed so that resistance to it and our place in the so-called imperial core can be made more fruitful and useful for confronting and struggling in solidarity with the resistance that is really taking up direct confrontation with the empire. And so I'm going to be on this panel in this conference over the weekend on it's called the the forum, it's a Unity in Struggle forum, and it's a 2-day conference in Toronto. I'll put the link where, if people are in Toronto, if they're listening from Toronto and want to attend, they can still, I think, register for it. Justin Potter is going to be there. I'm on a panel with Ilan Pape and Patrick Higgins on identifying empire, who and what we're up against, is I think the title of the panel. But there are lots of other workshops related to indigenous struggle, anti-Black racism, and practical kind of workshops on organizing. And so it looks like a really interesting and valuable event. I think, that's the website. Maybe we can throw it into the comments too. You can see that there we go. Two guests of the show, and I hope to get Ilan Pape on someday. And a bunch of other people. So go check it out. But the point is that, I was going to be discussing this anyway, and I thought not everybody's going to be able to attend, and who better to talk about the issues of empire than Sina, who is always kind of ending, his programs with the call of death to America. Well, so he clearly has some ideas about empire and how it needs to be, brought to an end. So I thought maybe, Sina, you could start us off and we could have a little bit of a dialogue, just beginning more broadly with, historic and present day contours of empire. What do we mean when we hear a lot of people talk about imperialism as a global system? How does it operate? And let's start there, maybe with some opening thoughts about that kind of broader structural. What is empire? How does imperialism work?
Yeah, no, I was kind of struggling with this myself, because I've been trying to articulate what I understand to be Iran's strategy in this war.
Mhm.
And partly I've come to realize the difficulty of getting people to understand is that most people don't understand the scale of the imperial architecture that the US has erected in 3 decades, barely 3 decades. What is it? I mean, maybe 4. 3 decades since Iraq War 1, since Gulf War 1, that this architecture has been put into place, and it is so vast and it has grown so immensely. But what's interesting, I come to realize this too, is that this is also an empire that is not peopled. Right. And so this difficulty American empire is in large ways this kind of informational sphere, first of all, that is sort of guarantor, the guarantor of which are the aircraft carriers and the planes and the tanks and the whatever. The sheer brute force of the American war machine, but really in its manifestations on the planet beyond the actual war, there's nothing ever to really compare it to. There are bases, sure, but these are manned by minimal number of people, right? There's not. For a long time, Americans have actually removed the people and put skeleton set of workers, and also aided and abetted by local contractors, right? And partly this is a result, and by contractors I don't mean I mean two senses. One are private military that they can, if they die, they don't have to be reported on, which is a popular thing now, not just in the US but across the world. But in general too, there's the sort of skeletal nature of the American empire is now being shown, to that, it was mostly done in the name of, it was mostly sort of subcontracted to tech, right?
Mhm.
The imperial, no empire the scale of the US could actually ever exist. So let me back up a little bit. I'm going to put on my literary brain here, because it's the Borges short story, where it's this famous map of the world that's so precise that they made it like 1-to-1 basically, and it became such a farce to continue making this map that there's nothing left of it, and like every now and then you'll run into like a shard of it, like, you know, flapping in the wind, like, you know, some whatever tumbleweed. That like this American empire has these global desires and demands and what's the word, like a global, it has these global aspirations, let's put it that way. But those aspirations are mostly subcontracted to local actors in the form of vassal governments in most cases. And in other cases, it's like the weird situation of the Gulf, where you have a country like Bahrain, which is sure a country. It has human beings in it. It has citizens. It has non-citizens. It has a government. It has a monarchy. You know, it looks and smells like a state, but these are like Western movie sets, like propped up by the West. Like, especially a place like Bahrain, we are talking about a tiny, unpopular minority Sunni government and state, and a police force and a monarchy, which is basically the Khalifa monarchy, which is a, correct me if I'm wrong, chat, but it's like an offshoot, I think, or unless you know, Adnan, too, it's like an offshoot of the same monarchy as the Sauds, I think, from what I understand, the Khalifas.
Some allied wing of the family clan.
Yeah. We don't call them Sauds, but essentially this is a kind of like one of the not province is again the wrong word, but long story short, that it was carved out of Iran not so recently. So the same bitterness that people say Russians have over Crimea, over Donbass and modern Ukraine, like a lot, that like feeling of like, oh, this was recently part of our country, that Iranians harbor that too about Bahrain. But I think the outset of all this, I wanted, before sort of going into depth of what's happening, you will see that the game that imperialists play in the region, like others can play at that too. And that's, for me, has been something that I didn't see coming, which I guess like speaks to like my lack of imagination in all of this. But at the same time, the problem is the same, though, is that we actually don't know what to think of the US empire. We don't know how to call spaces like Erbil, Iraq. We don't know how to call that place, right? Because it's this weird, like, I guess in some ways you could call it like protectorate of the US empire.
Yeah.
But really, oops, I lost my headphones. But oh god, now I rolled over it. But really, it's like it's kind of divided between NATO, and those NATO troops have fled, and this is not like because when you have a country like Iran that's so close and that's also so big, and it decides to say like you're not welcome in the neighborhood anymore, there's very little they can do. So there is some like Borgesian map drawing right now in what's happening in Tehran and in the various capitals of the Axis. Iraq, I imagine there's the places like Kuwait had the same sort of feeling around that Iranians have towards Bahrain, which is, like this was a recent province, and, like, why is this wealth redirected towards the West when it could stay here? So there is a lot at stake in this war. It is a longer, I would say, it is part and parcel of the same war that indigenous people have been fighting for the last 500 years.
Yeah.
And the difficulty of seeing the U.S. empire is really sort of something that we have to develop, because there are a lot of different Marxist models and a lot of like shorthands, but they fail. A lot of them failed. Like world systems, I rely on world systems. Like we don't like the U.S. imperial world system is not an American project. It's a pan-Western project.
Yes.
It's the sum total of all the Western settler colonial empires crammed into one, like huge ball of Play-Doh together. So that's, I would say, like, we have to work. I would like to work with, work on these concepts and think about it. And, maybe I have to go back to my grad student reading. I'm certainly not going to read Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's Empire, which was being taught when I was a kid and was being hailed as the new Lenin text. And we all know how that ended. But.
Well, the thing is, I'm so glad that you mentioned that Hart and Negri text from like, maybe it was like early 2000s, right? Like late 90s, early 2000s. basically the globalization era, and they were trying to reconceptualize, in an era of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unipolar moment filled with defeat, that there was this kind of end of the possibility really of resistance, and they were trying to kind of examine the way in which uh, capitalism had readapted itself in this way where it now mobilized. This was like the one interesting idea that they had, was that it now mobilized like identities for its project of globalization and marketing and so forth, which gets to one point that you made that I think is a key constituent component of the functioning of empire, is that despite its universalist and totalizing aspirations and ambitions, some kind of drive to constantly expand and control more and more of life on the planet Earth, is that it can't do so on its own resources. It has to create conditions where it recruits and subordinates as willing or unwilling, but ultimately it's better if they're willing, if they can be intimidated into being willing, sort of vassals, compradors, and collaborators, in order for it to work. Like, it doesn't work. Even colonialism in its earlier, most direct phase couldn't happen without recruiting local populations into these structures, which tells us that it is both about the people and a division between people, but also about a structure and where you are vis-a-vis that structure. So just to go further back a little bit and pick up on some of the things that you were talking about and give it maybe more of a shape and a longer historical trajectory, picking up on your point about the last sort of 500 years, is that you could say on some level that empire is the kind of political form or structure that integrates many peoples of different, like it's different than nationalism, many different people speaking maybe different languages, different religions, different cultures, etc., into some sort of subordinate position that integrates them, that takes their kind of local sovereignty into a kind of larger structure in order, through military kind of power, through economic power, through political subordination of others, for the sake of extracting their labor, their resources for an elite class that can control how it's distributed. And that in some sense you can't have, and we never have had, despite many of the theories of the classical political economists and so on, and even in the critique of capital, Marx only reserves like discussion of this until the very end of the first volume, when you suddenly realize that whole theory that is supposed to be some kind of seamless structure of exchanges and the commodity form and so on in this classical theory, is that none of it really works without empire, without what Marx calls at the end primitive accumulation, and that in fact actually, despite the sort of theory that it's supposed to continue to develop in some way, that it organizes exchange in this particular way, capitalism itself cannot do without that constant expansion. And it expands the most, the best cases we have for it actually expanding is through colonialism and to neo-colonialism, and maybe developing more rarefied mechanisms for controlling and dominating the world. But that it doesn't do it. It doesn't, capitalism doesn't thrive just because it's this efficient mechanism for, production. That's not actually how it works. And so, we'll come to the kind of question of resistance and so on, but I wanted to mention that when you talked about Hart and Negri, it reminded me as well that that kind of analysis that was totally defeatist is what allowed supposed Marxists like David Harvey and people who've been teaching capital for like 2 decades, and very popular, he popularized capital again. basically saying that, imperialism isn't a useful construct, like it doesn't make sense. If it ever made sense, it doesn't make sense now, because look at how capitalism has organized itself by doing production in China, and the offshoring. You can't really think about it as the empires in one location is like, oppressing others. And what I would say is the very mechanism he was talking about is the world system organizes for this unequal exchange. That's what we mean when we're talking about imperialism as a world system. It's not just whether you have the political form of an empire, it's how the world system is structured in the modern world system under imperialism. So the one point that I would make as a historian, the longue durée, is to distinguish between, when we use this word empire, we often are not careful in recognizing that there are many different things that fall into the category, from the political definition of an empire, that aren't imperialism. And the reason why is because an empire is an old form. The Achaemenids, we'll talk about Iran. It was an empire. It was the first universalist empire in the history of the world that said, yeah, it doesn't matter if you're like a Hittite, you speak this language, you speak that, you can all be part of like Cyrus the Great's lands, and he'll let you follow your religion and speak your language in your local area. Just pay your taxes and recognize the overlordship of Cyrus, right? So it was a world empire that didn't require, it was universalist political rule, but it wasn't universalist, kind of identity that everybody has to be the same. That's an old kind of idea of empire. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire under the Tsars, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all these like land-based, kind of older empires had a political dynasty, and they incorporated many different peoples in subordinate positions. That's totally different from the colonial empires, which I don't even think they should be called empires. What they are is just nation state colonizers, okay? Because they formed a political community of French people, of like, whatever, Dutch people, etc. And you had to be of that political class. They had formed a nation state that went out and conquered others, and they were always going to be in the subordinate position, and there was no way they could be included in the political class. They could have different positions in the army and in the bureaucracy to help as compradors or as people recruited into the imperial and colonial structure to govern and to rule and to extend it, but they could not rise into the decision-making political community because that was defined by a nation state. That's totally different from these old style dynastic empires, and we need to distinguish that's a different thing. So when people talk about, oh, empire, this is something the Zionists are always doing, is they say, oh, the Muslims, they were big imperialists because they had the Umayyad and then the Abbasid Empire, and they were colonizers. This is to confuse the old style pattern in the Near East, the ancient Near East, where you had Hittites coming from outside, and then they establish a dynasty. And, the Akkadians come in and they establish a dynasty, or the Iranians, the Persian Empire comes, and then they, it doesn't fundamentally change the character of social, economic, and political life. It's just there's a different dynasty ruling, right? And they come and they go, and usually, we're talking about in migrations of very small groups of people, and that was the case with the Arab Muslim conquest as well. Some thousands of people from the Arabian Peninsula managed to end up being rulers over the vast, numbers, millions of people who lived in Egypt and, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran. And a few thousands of people are in this kind of political military class. And over time, people learn a different language, and maybe over hundreds of years, they adopt a different, kind of religion, but there's the same people doing the same things, living in the same place fundamentally. And that's totally different from the way empire works now. which is to, really organize the whole world system for this kind of extraction and projection of power, in a totally different way than happened like for millennia, before it. So that was some kind of point that I thought would be useful to distinguish between old style empires and modern nation state colonization and its subsequent formations. And again, I would say, of course, that I think this starts to get a different form because of the Crusades. They fail, but they figure out how to do things in a different way, and then they take it into the Atlantic system and they fundamentally change. That's why what you said, that it isn't just the US, and this is something I want to ask you to maybe talk about more, how it operates, especially since there's always this fruitless discussion about like, well, is it Israel driving the policy, or is it like a sub empire regional, or is it, how do we analytically kind of frame all of this? And of course, it depends so much on where your level of analysis is. But the whole point that one point you made that I think is so important is this: the West as a whole, even though there were rival colonial, empires that fought one another, when it comes to the way it's operating today, or up to very recently, say through the Gaza genocide, is there was utter unanimity because it's a project of the West. And in fact, the whole international system that undergirds how imperialism actually works in the world was a mechanism to stop having these internecine wars and competition between the European colonial empires. They came up with this international system, the UN, first the League of Nations, then the UN, concepts of international law, international relations, and all that, to try and stop having all of these ceaseless conflicts between the French and the British, between the French and the British and the Germans, who are now arising as a like colonial imperial power. It was just to kind of create some sort of zone of peace, between them in their relations, to govern those relations so that they could more adequately project power over the rest of the world, right? So the question is that breaking down a little bit now with the Iran war and so on? But that idea that it's the West as a whole that is collectively part of this project, we saw very clearly in the way in which they would not break from, Israel's genocide in Gaza. They would not do anything to, even though it was making a complete hash and destroying that system that they had created to govern and domesticate imperialist rivalries and so on within a broader system. They can get rid of that because the most fundamental reason why that was put in place was just to have some kind of alliance and allegiance among these Western powers.
No, yeah, I appreciate that overview. And I think it's and I think I have like largely shied away from the term racial capitalism, but the sort of it's undeniable, however, the way that race and racialism, whatever you can call it, that like not racism itself, but the idea of a kind of racial ordering of the world and how that helps unite so many different sort of ununitable things in the midst of all this. I'm beginning to realize the scale of this like incredibly violent technology that human beings have developed, and have then one of the things, sort of hallmarks of this phase of European imperialism, or at least whatever this is, this kind of highest point of West European imperialism in this kind of Sino-American military beast that's unleashing upon this like vast swath of the world, like immense amount of violence, and has been doing it for like 20 years, more decades now, but in a concentrated way that's, I guess, a sort of a terrifying, what's the word? Like kind of portent of the future. What's the word I'm looking for? Something that like augurs the future. This is normal now.
An omen.
Yeah, an omen of the future. That like that this is that it's normal now to destroy 90% of structures in a place. Like they've normalized, like, and mind you, Americans were doing this. Like, look at pictures of Raqqa, look at pictures of Fallujah, like all the evil things that Israel did, America did before. It's just that they concentrated and they do it so shamelessly, where we're used to this kayfabe.
Yeah,
Like if
that's
you
right.
want like a kind of like larger performance of, oh, we tried, oh, we're doing an investigation, but Israelis dispense with all of that. And they're like, no, we're genocidal. It's uniting us. That's okay. Like deal with it. Like cry more. So this is the sort of the I want to say like media environment, but it's beyond that. It's a kind of like the discursive environment of our neoliberalism. On the one hand, lies to us and says, we care about your feelings. We care about your well-being. We care about human rights. But at the same time, they're like doing this wholesale slaughter around the world constantly in various countries. Now, this moment is interesting insofar as Iran has hurt the world empire, this world system, in ways I don't think it's ever experienced before, at least in terms of because of the unique combination of energy, capital, and shipping. And I think the strange role of the sort of strange coincidence of Iran's placement in the middle of like the most important choke point.
That's not a strange. I mean, this is an argument that I was making before, is that in some ways we are returning. There was this period, the 500 years, right, that you were referring and I was referring to, of the so-called European takeoff during this kind of colonizing and establishing imperialism and capitalist, forms of economy. All this, like this 500 years that is very atypical in world history, that was built not on like either the genius of like their values, blah blah, or based on some kind of material component of like long-term geographical kind of significance. Like the growing season is shorter, you can't grow as many kinds of crops, there's like a lot of limitations on building thriving society in Europe. They had to go after things that were part of the rest of the world, and in order to do so, they had to develop techniques of violence and technological domination, and so they managed to do that, and it elevated them into a status that is way beyond what would have been the other kinds of trajectories of development based on natural resources and your location and the possibilities of agriculture and your geographical location for trade between others. The reason why Iran has 6,000 years of history is because of where it is located, the resources that it had, how human society developed in relationship to it, and the fact that it was in this Gulf that's very navigable, and there was so much trade happening with, like, in the ancient world, in the late antiquity, in the Islamic era, all those stories. You're a literature guy. So all those stories in the Sinbad cycle, Sinbad, right? This famous sailor, they're all based on the fact that there was centuries and centuries of vibrant kind of commercial traffic and exchange happening in the Indian Ocean, and that the countries around the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz were like a total node in this that connected East and West Africa to Asia, etc. And so it has always been this transit point, and that has affected its development and why it was the pivot point for so much of world history. Let's go back to basics, is Christopher Columbus was trying to get around the Middle East, okay? And, Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese, they figured we cannot go past these Ottomans. We want to have access to the wealth and the goods and so on of the East, of South Asia, Southeast Asia, of East Asia, etc. And we have to figure out a way to get around them. They tried with the Crusades. They had these Crusader states, and they tried to get into the Red Sea, okay? They were trying to have a point on the transit trade that would be more independent, have an enclave in there. they were defeated, so they had to go around Africa, and other people said, maybe if the world is round, we can go all the way. By going west, we will get to the east. This is all because a place like Iran, was a major, geopolitical and civilizational force, right? So it's no accident they have this long history. It's no accident that Yemen has 3,000 years of recorded history. The Queen of Sheba is something that's in the imagination of the ancient world, that this kind of coastal area on the, on this small little state on this coastal part of the Eastern Mediterranean looks to Yemen for a reason, that they're a powerful place that's connected with this vibrant trade in the Indian Ocean and with the East. And that's why they're there next to the Bab el-Mandeb. It's like not an accident of anything. It's their history and geography that patterns. And I think what we're doing, what Iran is doing, and why this is a world historical shift and change, is through its technical prowess, through its spirit of defiance. It is confronting imperialism and reorienting and reworking. This was already happening because China is returning and has returned basically to its position in the world economy, that it had for thousands of years. And it has now come back to it after 2 centuries of being totally devastated by Western pressure, imperialism, colonialism. It's dominant. And so it makes perfect sense that a place like, Iran is reasserting itself. It is reorienting back to an older geography and an older history and pattern of development, where the advantages Europe managed to create as a temporary kind of supercharged development that happened through war, genocide, and violence over the rest of the world is now being countered. And that's why we have to defeat imperialism, is so that the world can kind of develop the way it's kind of just its nature. And fine, let's share the resources. Let's do that. But let's do that with peace, with respect, with integration for the peoples, all the peoples of the world. But there is a, group that obviously developed in a certain way. They want to hang on to those privileges of empire and all that it has given them for this 500 years, instead of recognizing now there's a rebalancing that is taking place. And if we want the planet to survive, if we want people to survive, we have to have a different model of development that isn't about, people in the West being able to have whatever heated swimming pools in the middle of winter and all this kind of stuff, right?
That's a very good point, and it actually highlights the criminality of what's been happening for the last 5 decades almost, which is that Iran has been artificially cut off from the planetary, let's say, economic body, simply because Americans had the power, and with their allies had the power to enact this kind of cordon sanitaire around Iran. So in many ways, I said this on an episode that I'm just about to post on my channel. We recorded yesterday with Navid, who's in Iran. He did this show. I'm sure you guys remember him, Navid Zainal, and Qmars from Delete Your Account. We did an episode yesterday morning, and it was a fun episode. I mean, Navid he's clearly, he's going through it. He's in Tehran. They hear bombs and stuff, but it seemed like the last few days hasn't been too bad. It's picked up again, the bombing, it seems. They have done some pretty insane war crimes today. They bombed the first and largest, the major steel manufacturing plants in Iran. They also bombed a power plant in Esfahan. So the lie that, Abu Naranha gave on whatever his social thing was obviously a lie, that it was just a ploy, a ruse. And literally right now, Iranians are firing back. I'm watching my Telegram, and it's happening right now. So this is the ability, massive explosions shake homes, cluster shells fall on Tel Aviv. The missiles strike came coinciding with a speech by the Yemeni armed forces. So the Yemeni armed forces are speaking now. They're probably announcing, in the name of God, within the framework of our design, and seeking to inflict greater defeat in light of the Yemeni forces keen on maintaining first the necessity of an immediate response from the American and Israeli enemy to international diplomatic efforts to stop. Come on. Sorry, they made an announcement. I'll figure it out. Maybe chat, you can fill out what happened with the Yemenis. But it's that this is a new situation for them, is that the ability of Iranians to close that technical gap in terms of projecting violence onto their enemy has changed. This has changed the fundamental nature of settler colonial sort of expansion, right? And that's what this is. This is an attempt to secure West Asia all for themselves for this next, period of time, whatever that is. Going after Iran, I'm sort of wrestling with like the logic of it, but I realized, they had no choice. Like Iran was exporting over 1 million barrels a day before all of this, that they were clawing back and the sort of entering into the sort of, let's say, the new economic model that the Chinese primarily, but also with the help of Russia, have erected around themselves. And this is that every day. And in some ways, and I've been saying this on like the various shows, I'm sorry to people who have to listen to me say the same thing 50 times, but it is kind of
is key to learning.
It's true. But like, this is they're you have to think about like the sort of Iran question. It's beyond just Palestine too, that it's like, this is like a Kramer versus Kramer battle, not to infantilize Iran, but this is like what I'm reaching for in the sense of like two different forces are fighting over like the sort of shape of the world. There's like there's the forces of like Asia that are trying to, including Iranians themselves, including the indigenous actors themselves, who are trying to work together and point the world to reorient it back to what it has been for the majority of world history, which is tilted towards this Asian axis, which is where most of the world is. Most of the global economy is. The American stupid GDP comes from people charging $10,000 an hour. But that the idea of like what drives the world, what pushes it forward, happens more or less in Eurasia and depending where too, especially now with China becoming the workshop of the world, that Iran sort of tilting towards this and becoming the main energy hub for China between Russia and Iran, that is to say. I think that this is a situation they couldn't allow to develop any further. And on top of that, they are sort of punch drunk with their successes in the region. And so this feeling of going from war to war to war and just like taking their exhausted army from like one misadventure to another and getting their asses handed to them by like indigenous actors, like imperialists just keep doing the same thing again. And now that something they've wanted to do for decades they're doing, which is try to destroy Iran. Iran is way too big. But the strategy, what unlike every other version of this we've seen in the past decades, like in, let's say, Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in wherever, Afghanistan, those battles stayed local, right? Each of those governments stayed local. They fought face to face against their imperialist aggressor, right? In the case of Yemen, it was, you were facing the Saudi and UAE military. And I think for a little bit, Qatar, I have to remember that one. I'm pretty sure Qataris were there first, the coalition of the unwilling. But in Syria, it was, they had to attack the mercenary forces. There was, in Libya, it was the same story, mercenary forces. Like in Iraq, the Iraqi army tried and failed it fell within 3 weeks. Like Americans were in Baghdad in 3 weeks. So this difference now is that Iran not only can hit back against the actual actors themselves, but also the network of actors supporting those actors. Mm-hmm. So and I've been saying this on podcasts, these are sanctions. Iran is sanctioning the Westoid world. And it's doing it through military means, it's doing it through economic means, and it's doing it through the energy weapon. So we are now in a situation
through cultural war too. Like just a quick little thing to let you continue with it is what you said at the beginning. You didn't say it, but actually this is what you did. You looked at understanding this concept of empire through the resistance of Iran. Like, what is shaping its resistance? And, it is targeted banks, right? It has targeted, the countries hosting U.S. military bases and allowing overflights. It has targeted, basically all that web of connections that is what makes imperialism, function. Cyber attack, like the Handala group that has been getting all kinds of like data leaks and things like that. But in the cyber war, that's showing that it also has all of this intelligence capability to be able to find and all the targets that it wants, etc. And also contributing to the psychological war, the culture war, the Lego videos, everything else, the trolling of Trump, the using of social media in a way to like kind of hit back for the, tweeter in chief, the poster in chief. I mean, this is designed, it seems to me, and it illuminates like, how does imperialism work? We can see how imperialism works by what Iran is targeting and doing, because they have sussed out and understood the problem that they're facing with imperialism. It's military, it's political, it's economic, it's all these things. And they are showing where those things connect up in where their resistance goes.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. You're an Iranian general, okay, or like you're an Iranian, let's say, like deep state dude, okay, or IRGC deep state dude, intel officer. You watch the American military move into your neighborhood, like for 30 years. You watch them set up bases, set up observation posts. You watch them move their big expensive weaponry, their big planes, their everything. You watch everything right there. Literally, like you could hold binoculars and like maybe not binoculars, but like you could it's literally right there. This is their entire neighborhood. And in fact, historically, this is where Iranians had vast amount of influence. So now think about this situation, to go back to what you were saying before. For decades, Iranians are watching, I'm trying to be not evil and say this, but the lowest form of scum humans to ever exist, imperialists and their agents, get comfortable and get rich off of the wealth in this region, right? They're watching boats go by, tankers go by, and it's like an old school, haberdashery. You hear cha-ching, cha-ching, and those are all, that's happening as Iranians are getting more and more immiserated. Like, we have to pull up the GDP chart. Pull up the the GDP chart. I know I just said GDP is fake, but as fake as it is, you can see the violence that it was done. Like, I'm not saying to you to pull it up, but is that if you're watching this, or like you're just hanging out on your phone, it's like an insanely violent drop. Like that is something that should not have happened. That was a crime against our people. And that's a genocidal warfare. Siege is a form of genocide. So Iranians are watching all of this. Their own dreams are getting flushed down the toilet. They can't make anything happen. They're more and more at the behest of their own native comprador bourgeoisie that would like nothing more than to keep making some extra sort of grift off the side, because that's what happens when that's what happens in, first of all, a lot of global South countries. It's pretty normal especially when you have like low tax revenues, that like people have to bribe their way into getting stuff done. And over time, that hurts the legitimacy of the state. And then on top of that, there were all this, Iranians were dependent upon Qatar as our agents to get out that smuggled fuel, which was being sold cheaply, because Iran had to operate in this gray zone of this, or the not even gray zone, it's like a black zone, this pirate market. So now the pirates have become like the chief bankers, right? So like it was the old Uno switcheroo, Uno reverso move, and Iranians have now taken what the system that was used against them, the global finance and global shipping and energy markets used against them to stifle their growth. and is now doing that to enrich themselves and get what for them they see as the very correct amount of support, that very correct amount of fees that should be paid, a relatively small fee for passing through Iranian territorial waters and for passing through Iran's sphere of influence. And if you don't like it, don't get your oil from here. Like, okay, let your societies collapse. So what I said earlier about in terms of like the accident, what I meant more in terms of like the accident of geography, like Iran accidentally being there at this corner of the planet. It could have been somewhere else, right? It could have been landlocked, but then, as you were saying, it wouldn't have been Iran. And like Iran is Iran because it is at this sort of nexus of global trade and global history. And removing that was a deep, profound violence, not to Iran, but to the world itself. Like, I really need to like push on this for people, is that hexing Iran was like this decade-long project that billions of people around the world take part in every day when they say like, oh, the regime in Iran. Like these are acts of colonial hubris that every day Iranians have to like put up with. And like I've dealt with my whole life, like just things people say to you and just like the nonsense they sprout at you. So finally now you have this weird situation where there is a, let's say, agency on the Iranian part to now inform the world that we're no longer going to be treated as a pariah state. And in fact, if you want to treat us as a pariah state, we'll treat you as a pariah state and you won't get your precious commodities. So there is a very radical, not only is Iran able to sort of enforce a violence regime on their enemies, and they're doing it. Let me check my Telegram. They're doing it right now. Hebrew media, more than 12 sites were hit. This is like today. So like the fact that Iran can do this, the fact that Iran is independent enough to actually fire these weapons and into the heart of the most defended airspace in the world tells you that sovereignty is not dead. Global sovereignty is not dead. We don't have a few superpowers and a bunch of vassals yet. We do have a few superpowers, a lot of vassals, and a few independent states. We lost one, maybe, possibly. I mean, one has its president being held hostage in New York City, in Venezuela, with the country of Venezuela. That the sovereignty is this rare gem, and Iran is showing how you get sovereignty, which is use missiles, collapse the gap between you and the enemy. You can't afford planes. You're not Iran, a country like is not able to afford planes. They're not available to afford the maintenance required. And on top of that, look, think about the kind of future the Israelis have for themselves there. They have no resources of their own. They're totally dependent on Azerbaijani oil shipped to them through Sultan Erdogan. They're totally dependent upon a whole apparatus of petrochemical development and things fed to them. They can't even properly feed themselves. They're not food sovereign. So think of what they're seeing. Like they get in their painful blows. Okay, like they did some painful, evil stuff today, hitting nuclear reactors. Like this is insane. Like this is some insane shit that they do. But long term, like this is the way of them signaling that like, oh, the American empire can't protect itself. How can it protect us? So they lost their Arab shield. They lost their Yankee Doodle Dandy shield. And now it's just them and the region they claim to be indigenous from. Now they get to be indigenous. Now you get to fight on your own because the U.S. empire, it can't stay there. I'm sorry. If you're an aircraft carrier and you get chased out by missiles and then you come up with this Looney Tunes story about dryer lint the size of, like an elephant foot catching on fire and then a banana peel slip and then a private interestman slipping on a banana peel and then hitting his head on the button that said on, like this is like what they're trying to convince you that like 3 planes fell in Kuwait because of a Kuwaiti pilot decided to do that. Like they're obviously lying. So the longer this goes on, the more irreparable damage to the global economy. And yeah, Iran gets to say to the world, like, we didn't do this. Blame your Zionist foreign policy. Like the costs of Zionism is now going to be borne on the world. It's not just going to be the people of the region. So I'm sorry to people who have had to hear me say this 50,000 times. I'm about to release an episode today where I say basically the same thing, but it's but to go back, but I did want to say one more thing in terms of to go back to the original question is that
Mhm.
there is no of like we still don't have a real way of even seeing the U.S. empire, that it exists in so many different manifestations, that it's like the U.S. empire is, you know, alive and well in like some village in Syria where it's like overrun by freaking Uyghur Salafi psychos who, like, that's the US empire. Like, that's agents of the US empire. The US empire is, you know, like Kurdish Marxists living on some base, like Mazlum Abdi living on a US base, you know, like the head of Rojava, like the head of the leader of Rojava, so called, this anarchist paradise, which doesn't exist anymore. But he was living on a US base. I mean, this is a farce. This is a farce that if the US needs to array its forces and prop them up in the way it does, when they go, they won't, they're, you know, they'll have to figure it out. So we are in a decolonial moment. It is extremely violent. Maybe it may end up being one of the more violent ones we've seen ever, in terms of the length of time vis-a-vis the amount of destruction. But I don't know. This all bets are off.
We have examples of Algeria, you know, 800,000, maybe a million.
But it was mostly contained to Algeria,
and
that's the thing. This is the difference. And on top of that, Iran is in the middle. It's the biggest, most powerful actor in the world's most sensitive. Like, Iran is a bull in the world's most important China shop. Like, that's the reality. And like, they've managed to like get the bull trained to like the bull has decided for 47 years to not do this. Like it's decided like, okay, because Iran could have smashed the entire Gulf system long ago. They probably could have done this in the 90s. They probably not, maybe not 90s, but in the 2000s, they were already a missile power. They were like not the missile power they are today. They could have done this in the 2015s, okay, because the Gulf countries were directly attacking Iranian. I mean, that's the thing. That's why they have mercenaries, is that they can hide behind mercenaries. But everybody knows who was funding whom in Syria. And so, like, even right now, Iranians have like a long memory, and they're like, oh, do you remember all those people of ours you got killed in Syria? Guess what? Like, we're about to cost you $2 billion. Like, we're about to destroy your economy. And they have. Like, the GCC is like never coming back. It's never coming back.
Well, look, Kuwait didn't come back after, you know, I mean, they had enough basically in US and European, you know, funds that, you know, they're just living off of like the earnings. But as a place that was, you know, there was a period where the Kuwaitis were the flamboyant, you know, ones. They were the UAE before the UAE was the UAE, you know, like you heard about the Kuwaitis because they were throwing their money all around. They were, you know, they had a presence, and they're so reduced as a result of, like, you know, even the war to save them. They never came back because these are places that, you know, without the oil, they're really nothing, right? Like they didn't exist as like entities. They're all colonial constructs. Once the oil was discovered, they had sort of strategic value on the coast for the British in resupplying and controlling, you know, kind of naval operations, you know, in the greater, you know, India zone, because that's what they're, you know, they were concerned to protect their, you know, their colony there. And then once oil was there, then they become, you know, incredibly important for the British Navy. And so they created these little enclaves to sequester the oil wealth from being shared with the people of the region and used for the development of those societies. And so there was no, you know, it's an accident of geology that these locations have all of this oil. But without that, you know, for thousands of years, these were kind of vaguely, you know, kind of tribal areas with Bedouin and so on. They couldn't support the kind of economic and political weight that they've been propped up to do within the imperial system. And so, as you say, I mean, it's going to be really interesting whether there's any way for them to come back. Certainly not on the model. Saudi could be okay because it's actually like a country, more or less. It can grow some food. It has, whatever. What I forget the population, but it's probably like 30 or 40 million, people. It's a country, Whereas
Well,
like
how many of them are actually so-called Saudis, and how many of them are, quasi slaves living under these like insane?
well,
That's
and
the thing. Like all of
even
those
apart from that,
systems, but all of these systems though rely upon unlimited, cheap labor and mobility of that labor and mobility of a class of people who, based on like a racial ordering system that we all know how it works, that those people have like unlimited fluidity of movement. That's gone. There's not, like, as long as Iran is being subject to what the Americans want to subject to, then they won't have the Gulf as a basis, and that money is not going in. We're already seeing, like, everyone's going to start naming their kids fucking force majeure sooner or later because it's happening so much. Like, this is not like you can hear the grinding sounds of the like late capitalist system in just this crisis. Forget the worsening crises that this will now trigger, right?
Mhm.
Like, we are hitting planting season. Okay.
Yeah.
We are in the planting season soon in a lot of cold climates. And if things don't go in the ground, if soil isn't prepared, like, our food system is about to get a lot more stressed. And it was pretty stressed before, and it's going to get a lot worse now. Like, I said this on another stream. My local farmer told my butcher that his fertilizer bill is going up 100K. So,
Mhm.
like, these are not insignificant developments, and all of this was for Zionism. Like, that's the thing. Like, that's by Iran waiting for them to attack was now they can say, like, don't put this on our feet. We didn't start this war. These are the consequences of a war that was imposed upon us. Go take it up with your precious Zionist embassy. So this is there are all kinds of moves being taken place right now. My next kid's name is Khorram Shah. So, like, this is not we are in a truly profound moment, and I don't know, do you think people are getting it? Like, do you
No.
think no?
I don't think so at all. I mean, of course, I am surrounded by academics who are already divorced from a lot of social reality in the enclave and community that they exist in, and there's plenty of stress and pressure happening within relative terms in those institutions because of suppression of political dissent and austerity and cutbacks. But like, what's happening in the world, I feel like people have not processed how potentially significant and world transforming this moment is. And part of it is because they haven't had the analysis that we were just talking about in terms of how this is actually reorienting, imperialism, through these kind of it's a return in some ways to the fundamental center of the global economy being in the East, and how that is going to reorient. And this is an acceleration, right? This is an acceleration of that process that was already underway. But I think the elites do recognize and understand that now. Like, of course, they also made all kinds of crazy calculations that they have to do this now. And I don't think it's just for Zionism. I mean, that's one easy way to kind of dramatize how insane this whole, bid is. But it's because the entire ruling class of the West, and those that they have recruited as compradors into their, imperialist system, recognizes that fundamentally the trajectory of history, economy, and therefore politics is going a different direction. And the only chance, even if it is only a slight chance, is to leverage the one resource that the West has developed historically of being capable, and very, almost exclusively capable, of, in a certain brutal way, which is colonial violence and genocide, using its military, in ruthless, unrestrained ways to try and devastate societies of the global south, sow chaos among them, divide them so they cannot be organized and resist, and therefore they can be exploited, ruled, their resources taken, and this is what feeds this vampiric kind of empire, sustaining itself in its undead sort of life artificially longer than it really would should be able to do. And so they're leveraging that now while they have it. But they had such confidence in this, such arrogance in their capabilities, and such racism and Orientalism and Islamophobia and just this colonial denigration of the other, that they weren't able to see and recognize how potentially resistant and sophisticated, and they designed their tactics to kind of serve imperial needs, which is quick in and out, devastate their leadership, and try and declare a win and put in place a low cost solution of somebody who will do the work like the Shah used to do, like these Gulf
low cost,
states
low
do.
effort. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Like it
like
takes a lot
the King of Jordan. Yeah,
yeah, like they want, that's what they want, that's what they need. They thought maybe we can arrange that, but that's what led them in this kind of backfiring situation. That so I do feel like it's an interesting question to think. It's politically useful to a certain extent, and I see Iran doing this, is that they're trying to make it all about Trump, like distinguish Trump from the American people, right? Like it's all about Trump and the buffoon and the guy who doesn't understand, and they're mocking him, and all these wonderful Lego videos that just pillory him. And I feel that there is a design to this strategy and this tactic. Politically, it's to divide him from the American people. It's also to weaken him as a commander in chief, so that the more people will be contacting Mike Preisner's, conscientious objector, like to try and get out of this. There will be more laundry fires and mysterious kind of problems with toilets, and that's a good tactic in a way to direct that, and by making pillorying Trump, that's one target. And even Ali Larijani did it in his tweets, is like just responding. So it's at the psychological level, the psy war, and make it about the kind of figure of Trump, who can be more easily kind of sacrificed potentially, right? He could be scapegoated. That's one thing that could happen. The other is also say you're doing this for the Epstein class, and build upon the resentment and the shocking revelations about the true nature of the elites in Western society and their corollaries and compradors. That's another useful kind of like on the psy war, information war, politically. And then the last thing is to blame it on Israel, right? Which like people in the right are happy to do. There's a lot of people in the right to kind of go back to that, like, yeah, let's scapegoat Israel and the Zionists. It's all them, and maintain this kind of sleeping beauty, as Frantz Fanon would say, like he says at the end of Wretched of the Earth, like, sorry Europe, like you can't have this like sleeping beauty, we were so innocent, we didn't know, and immunize people from in the US from taking responsibility, right? Like that's what it accomplishes to blame Israel. It's all kind of interconnected, but it's actually, in the moment, you can see how it's politically useful because it divides and creates the fissures that can be exploited to turn the imperialist factions in against itself, rather than what we had just been talking about, which is the incredible unanimity that they have had in supporting the Zionist crusader states, right? Just like they did for the Crusades. It was a pan-European, pan-Latin Christendom, kind of commitment. If you were part of the alliance, of Christendom, then you went on crusade and you supported those crusader states. And anything that happened there and happened to them was an emergency. You had to organize a new crusade to go protect them, expand, etc. And sometimes the Crusader states, because they were, kind of dependent, independent units, sometimes they had their own aspirations that didn't necessarily fit perfectly within the strategy of Latin Christendom as a whole. Sometimes individual lords of Antioch wanted to expand, or they made alliances with with a Muslim ruler because they didn't want to confront them, but they wanted to expand in a different direction. And so, of course, you have, depending on the level of analysis, you can distinguish certain kinds of strategies and interests, but you can't make sense of them without putting them in the broader total that they are part of the same kind of system and the same alliance. And that's what we see now. The question really is will we see, given the resistance of Iran, its effective resistance, will we see fissures and fractures in this Western alliance? Already Spain has, shown that it wants to be independent of full complicity in U.S., military. There's talk politically about even withdrawing from NATO. That's like saying we're going to break away from the Pope's crusades and we're not going to go, so that's an interesting problem.
No, that's one of the things I talked about in my episode with Jay, I think like last week when we talked about kayfabe. That idea that
persisted with that episode, the wrestling talk, I was just like, okay, I don't make sense of this.
It's not wrestling though. It's like it's carny. It's like a carny thing.
Yeah.
It's just made popular by wrestling because wrestling is more popular now than carnivals. But basically, it's the larger. It's a shorthanded way, a good way of describing the kind of question, the sort of general like absurdity of our like informational environment where you accept these like absurd, like, that like all these European states that are so-called democracies just happen to do exactly what the US tells them to do, even if it goes against their own interest. That like our Canadian prime minister does basically the same thing. He like goes to Canada and he goes to China to like basically perform some kind of sovereignty and then comes back and immediately toes the line on Iran. And because it's the ethno state is their precious little child. You know what it's like? Did you ever see Rosemary's Baby? They're like all that's what it is. And like the baby and like the devil obviously is America. And Palestine, unfortunately, is that woman. Is like forced to like is unfortunately Mia Farrow. And that's the thing. Like it's not this and all of those scheming old people around them, that's the West. Like this is their precious child. Like this is their precious, like central thing. And then the whole philo-Semitism and the whole like ridiculous thing of like, oh God, these people's lives matter so much. Their feelings matter so much. They just, oh my, it's like ridiculous. Like what, who cares? Like, what is this farce? Like the whole foundation of our societies is racism and ethnocide and genocide. And you're told every day that one racism is the worst thing you can ever do against the planet. Like this is the most evil thing, right? Racism against Jewish people are the most evil thing. Like this is like what October 7th did was force the world to force the world to sort of like continue this kayfabe at greater and greater cost. And that cost, as you were saying, is sort of like, it's not, I don't think it's ripping at the actual, now it is because of what Iran is doing, but until now, it wasn't actually tearing at the foundations of that kayfabe. But now the kayfabe is breaking. Now societies have to face like a really difficult thing. Like, are you going to face society? Are you like governments have to like face this kind of weird sort of Sophie's choice, which is, like, okay, societal collapse with no energy and no food, possibly no money. And those things could still happen even if they got the oil. Like the war could happen tomorrow, and those things could still happen. Or continue to kowtow to like the American pariahification and immiseration of Iran. That's it. That's the choice they have to face. And many countries now, big ones, India, Pakistan, China, somebody else. What was the country? I can't remember the countries they let through, but those countries have decided like, okay, we have no
Bangladesh and Pakistan.
Bangladesh. Yeah. Like these are because there's another thing in all this too, is that imagine Iran was vindictive with India right now. So like this is the double-edged sword I was talking about. Like you now have this weapon of geography called this closing the Strait of Hormuz, and that's an extremely powerful weapon. Rosemary's Baby is Sophie's Choice. Yeah, my brain, the way it works is not good. It's like a web of like mixed references. But like that is a painful choice, right? Like with Hormuz and like pulling that weapon. But so now Iran also, Sri Lanka was also asked that in, because now Iran faces its own burden, which is like, should I let the society of Sri Lanka like live? Like, should we let them continue to put gas in their cars? Like, should we? So now imagine Iran is like vindictive with one of those countries. You've now made an enemy, a permanent enemy of that country, and it's your neighbor. Right? Like Iran, now you'll say like, Iran is, if you're like a Gusano in the chat, I doubt it. But like you'll be like, Iran is hitting its neighbors. But no, Iran is hitting American bases on its neighbors' lands. And that's what the Iranian state can say in its defense. Be like, you're the one who allowed these bases to flourish. And these bases are now supporting attacking us. What, we're supposed to like pretend and not do anything? So that's a strange difficulty that they're in. Now, Bahrain is an interesting thing. Bahrain, deeply unpopular government. They already faced a major insurrection or major uprising in 2011, which was violently put down. That's true. The Sri Lankan did rescue the Iranian Navy band survivors. That's true. I also think India's role in that has been, at least in my mind, from what I've seen, has been muddled by a little bit of Pakistani disinformation. Your people are up to a little bit of trouble online, and they're like doing AI videos. So actually, if someone maybe in the unless you know exactly like the actual role of India in that farce, I think was exaggerated. Maybe from what I can tell, was there's a lot of disinformation in that story. It was the Dina, it was called, the ship.
Right.
the INS Dina, I want to say. I don't want to say INS, IRNS. And that was like a war crime. They killed like teenagers, kids, like young sailors, like a marching band. Like this was, and they were completely undefended. And then the U.S. crowed about it, right? So the kayfabe of the U.S. empire's liberalism is also gone. So that's another thing of all of this, of like Trump breaks kayfabe.
Yeah.
And he also is like, and that's one of his hallmarks, is like the farce of all of this, of like him just kidnapping Maduro is breaking kayfabe, right? Like that's, like threatening Cuba for just because Marco Rubio's bored and they want like an easy W. Like these are strategic decisions that are costly to the U.S. empire, right? Because China, Russia, those are both allies of Cuba. And Venezuela too. So like these are all costly, and there may be other things that hurt the US, but because the US is in this mode of I'm going to flex on anybody I can, this is where we're at. So it's a dangerous moment for people who are in the direct vicinity of the US empire. Yeah. And it's also a dangerous moment for the whole planet, because this empire will also take us down. And wants to take us down, like this, like the attack on. There was an attack on, like there seems to be a global attack on energy infrastructure. It's not just in West Asia. They attacked the largest refinery, I want to say, or was it fuel storage tanks in Russia? It's a Ukrainian attack. I'm sure that wasn't helped by any of the NATO powers. And then there was also an attack in Port Arthur, Texas. Valero refinery went up in flames. That's, I think it's like the 11th largest refinery in the U.S. So we seem to be in an energy war. We are in an energy infrastructure war, and God help us, guys. We are these ruling classes, these Epstein types. They will do anything to hold on to power, and they will take us to hell with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we have to, figure out how to resist best against them, because they have a death grip on this planet. And we can't be afraid of what they may do because we resist, however, right? Because they're going to kill this planet. They're going to kill us, you know, uh, one way if we do nothing, right? So our hope has to be in resistance. And but that, we all have to learn. I was very hopeful. I was on a panel, in Philly on Wednesday night. And I said, I'm very optimistic. That, however, doesn't mean that I think it's going to be easy or that we're not going to go through some really difficult times. I mean, if Iran is to succeed, it may, unless like reason happens, unless we manage somehow, I don't know how, but it's what we always talk about, and, manage to help put the brakes on the imperialist war from within and create so much, kind of division and discontent and all of that, that it restrains. It's up. Then it's going to be up to Iran, and it is really fundamentally up to Iran. And one of the only techniques that they can effectively use to put economic and political pressure on the US has consequences for the world economy. And of course, people in the global south are more vulnerable to the pain, right? So these are all kind of conditions of the imperialist world order. There's been so many layers, created in this system to immunize the suffering of the world, by like the elites, to immunize themselves from really the pain that they are causing and from the consequences of that. But eventually it's going to happen. And so that's why I'm very optimistic. But as you point out, there are a lot of challenges and it's going to be difficult. But we need to understand those difficulties are part of the process of trying to free, the world as a whole from this. But I also, before maybe asking you the final question, that is also going to be some subject of discussion on the panel tomorrow at Unity in Struggle Forum in Toronto. I want to remind everybody to like the stream, share it, subscribe to the channel, to both channels, and also remind you about the fundraiser. I will talk a lot more about it in a future office hours, but support for Gaza, my future Gaza students, okay, so that they can participate in the online course that they would like to take with me, to give them internet access and cover other costs locally for them in Gaza. If you can donate to the third round of SPOCs for Gaza, a kind of fundraiser on Chuffed. I put the link in there that is organized by the MIT graduate students who are in solidarity with Gaza and have organized these classes and recruited me and others to do these classes. If you can support, and also Sina, maybe you can mention your fundraiser as well now before our final question.
Yeah, please, folks, if you can, please consider helping donating to Mohammed and his siblings. They're a family of orphans in Gaza. I've been trying to help them, and donations have really dried up. So please help them if you can. Anything helps. I appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, and if you can put that link in the chat, that would be helpful.
I'm not logged into the chat, so you have to.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Where do I find it?
It's I put it in the private chat.
Oh, in the private. Great. I will drop that in. But okay, while I am getting that, let me ask you, Sina. The world has been treated to the particular antics, culture, the grotesqueries of the Iranian diaspora in this moment. And, for many people who didn't live in like Toronto, didn't hang out in North York or in parts of Los Angeles, they may not have been that familiar with this particular population of people who left Iran. There's a lot of, people left Iran for a lot of reasons, some for education, others because, sanctions, what has been difficult to live there, others, for political reasons, but like the predominating group that came around the time of the Iranian Revolution were pro-Shah, and a certain segment of the society that were supportive of his kind of westernization, so-called modernization program, and they have been militating for U.S. intervention, for sanctions, for regime change, and investing in these media channels that are constantly misinforming and involved in the U.S.-Israeli war against the Islamic Republic. The question, really is not just to kind of talk about how awful they are, but in the context of empire, to kind of understand analytically sort of what role they play in the battle of narratives, what these reactionary elements within the diaspora have as impacts on the reality for people on the ground, and how have they been used as elements in form of kind of like, imperial counterinsurgency. And, like, tell us a little bit about your people. Okay.
So I've wrestled with this a lot lately for obvious reasons, but I'm also like I've said this before, like I'm really weary of the concept of diaspora itself, because that's like you are doing some immense amount of work, when you semantic work, which is to say, or significatory work, because you're like tying a lasso around a really disparate group of people that's like spread out across the world in various population centers in large numbers, but also, so you can't really speak of, but also even in those centers, the people themselves are so diversified in terms of their origins and their own immigration story and their own immigration story. Sometimes those aren't the same, right? Because some people go from one country to another to another. So but there's, at the outset, I will say this, is that Iranians are among the most propagandized people in the world. I really believe this. I got my TV on, and I'm going to my Persian channels, and I'm going through all of the different Oftab TV, that's Sunlight TV, Gem USA. These are all like the Persian channels, and all of these things are catered towards a class of Iranians. A lot of them, like various generations of them, some are like my grandparents, like, grandparents' age, people who left Iran. Maybe they were with the previous ruling class, and they left and they kind of settled in a life in various places: Vancouver, Los Angeles, Southern California, Virginia, Maryland. There's like pockets of it. Chicago, Illinois, a little bit. Like there's pockets of it, and they also like Houston, Texas, also same story. And
also in
those
like
people,
France.
And then the U.S. and then there's Sweden, France, right? Like there's different communities, and within those communities, you have the same diversity of political opinions as you would in Iran. That you have, but you also, actually no, I take that back. You also have like a heavily weighted towards Gusanos, because that's Gusanos leave. A lot of Gusanos leave, and then they make hating Iran their whole personality, right? Because you're allowed to be revolutionary when you talk about Iran in the West. That's the only, you're allowed to be political. You're allowed to say incendiary things. You're allowed to participate in, like radical psyops. You're encouraged, in fact, to participate in it, right? So I think Iran, I said among the, not the U.S. is the most propagandized. I think the U.S. is the most propagandized, but I think Iranians are among the most propagandized in the world. And especially when you roll through the channels, like you go to Iran International, the way they whip you up, the way they whip up people's feelings, there is nothing you can combat against that. Like the production values, especially when you compare it to like Iranian state TV, you can't even compare. I mean, the budget of these things are like $250 million in some cases. I mean, these people have deep pockets. They have the entire Westoid information sort of production sphere available to them. They have the entire archive of BBC content available to them, BBC Persian, that is. And they also have been run by deep pockets, and they also have the assistance of Western intel. So I've seen this action. I've seen this series of actions where, like online account receives video from inside Iran. That video gets posted. Then the editors at Iran International put it on the TV. And like, this is an extremely effective system of propaganda and like information warfare. And it's being done on like network TV, cable TV. And it's being done with like the blessing of, like Ofcom or whatever, the British, because that's where Iran International is based. So it's like, so in that way, what the specter of the reactionary Iranian diaspora, you have to understand it through that prism, because you have this situation where you have this diversity of opinion, but you have one sector of opinions that are propagandized to you as representative, right? And so this is whenever this is the secret, chat. For people who are listening to this, I'm going to tell you the key. Whenever you hear like an Iranian Westoid speaking, you'll hear like a moment, often, not always, but a moment. If they're more responsible, they won't do this, but most of them do this because I listen for it, which is then they go from here's my opinion to here's the opinion of many Iranians. How many is like depending on how ambitious they are in their rhetoric, but that little hop, skip, and a jump from here's the opinions I share with the people around me in my class and maybe some of my family members, and then there is like a little trick they pull, a little leisure domain or whatever, like where they then broadcast that onto like tens of millions of people, right? And so I've always been wary of falling into that trap. I've probably been guilty of it. I've probably been very guilty of it, probably, given how much I talk about Iran, I'm sure. But that's something I try not to do, because that's the same thing with like the diaspora thing of you find a bunch of stupid fascists, you pay them or you reward them in one way or another, in attention or in money or in both, with behaving like troglodyte morons for Trump himself personally, right? So maybe if we can find it, there's the one of the dancing Iranian woman with an incredibly short shorts on. She's very conventionally attractive, and she's like playing YMCA. She's not even dancing on beat to it, and she's doing this stupid little Trump, little Chris Farley dance, and it's like they made that psyop for him. Like, that's the thing. Like, Zionists worked with Iranian gusanos to create that celebratory wave of psychos, of who were then celebrating the murder of Ayatollah Khamenei, right? Like, that was prepared. That was part of this project of killing him. That was a part and parcel. I have family members who went to one of those rallies, okay? So this is like something in my own family. I have other family members who posted atrocity propaganda. I have other family members who reached out to my own family and said, "Hey, how come you're not posting atrocity propaganda?" Like, this is what's happened. Like, a bunch of people who are not political on a day-to-day basis, who ignore the fascism and imperialism of the American state and military and everything it does, who live comfortable, irrelevant lives in the corporate world of America, like most American normies. What's then happened is, the moments like this, you're thrust into the spotlight, and then you're given a mic and say, "Tell us how you feel, little dingleberry Donnie from West Hills, California. Yeah, tell us how you feel." And then they just do the monkey thing, and I'm so excited. Blah, 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 blah. Like, but what happened after 24 hours? It became apparent that this was not the W they thought it was going to be. Iran immediately started hitting back, and it was way bigger than they realized that it was going to be. So I don't want to get into the situation of diagnosing the Iranian diaspora.
I do wonder what are they saying now in light of the fact that it clearly didn't work, that there weren't millions of people just waiting for any opportunity of weakness in the Islamic Republic of Iran's governing order and system to leap into action, and that in fact actually what has happened is that people are flooding the streets chanting death to America, death to Israel, even under bombardment, and shouting Allahu Akbar. Even secularist people, are chanting religious slogans. The religious people I've heard are learning some of the nationalist songs that they didn't know the words to. And what you have is a revival of revolutionary culture that reminds people a lot of what it was like, maybe even more, because the nation wasn't under attack during the revolution. It was, kind of trying to throw off.
I mean, it was, but it was immediately attacked by Iraq. I mean, so that's
it's
kind of true,
Iraq,
though. That's the
right
thing.
after,
and that helped consolidate the revolution into this war economy, like a sort of affective war economy, which is to say. But what's interesting, I think, to go to your point, sorry to interrupt you, to go to your point, though, is that this is that it did backfire, because I say this all the time, I don't think the Islamic Republic will fall. The Islamic Republic will not fall.
We know it backfired,
without
but what are they saying? What are they saying about the fact
so that's the thing. Yeah. What are they saying? One thing I did notice is there were a lot fewer monarchist flags around nowadays. Maybe in Southern California, people are shameless still and they post them. But in Toronto, I was there, a couple of weeks ago, and I saw more than I ever had before, about a month ago. And then I was back again. And I was like, oh, fewer ones this time. And this is a new thing. Remember, I grew up in Toronto, and I saw the Iranian community get bigger and bigger. There was one store, I always tell this story, there was one store in what is now known as Tehranto. There was one store in that section of Toronto. Now there are 8 kilometers of Iranian businesses, which, it makes me happy at a certain point, because it's no, this is great for shopping. But then you realize this is that there are also consequences to all of this, because the nature of Iranian political body is that it's very divided. Now, was the war supposed to divide them further? Yes. Was killing Khamenei an attempt, as you said, to work this for them? Yeah, it was an attempt. Did it work? No, it was the opposite. It had the opposite of intended effect. So we are in this strange historical irony where, the embittered class of losers of Iranian, they were losers. I don't mean that in I do mean that in the pejorative sense, but in the sense of they lost the revolution. They lost the country that they used to enjoy being the elite on. Now they got their Khamenei prize, right? They got their memes and they got their W, right? This is how also Zionists rule over their own society, by the way. They do this thing of, we got our scalp. Sorry to use a racist metaphor, but it kind of applies here, is that, look, we got our trophy. And this is our victory, right? And so it consolidated the base, and it gave them sort of their meme arsenal for a couple of days. But the costs of that are way greater than a couple of memes. Explain to me the downside of killing Khamenei to actually Khamenei himself. The guy dreams of being martyred his whole life. Martyrdom is a rank that Shia Muslims dream of attaining. Okay, so you gave him what he wanted, and then you created a political situation that helped revive and consolidate that revolutionary spirit that had very noticeably been waning over decades. And then on top of that, just as importantly, or maybe more importantly, you now have given license to the radicalized members of the survivors of this attack on this government. You've now given them license to go out and seek vengeance upon the people who did this, and they get to do whatever they want now. I mean, obviously the Iranians, unlike their enemies, don't fight the way their enemies do, and they don't do war crimes left and right. They attack military bases. They attack, and they've actually been holding back from hitting industrial sites, but now with today's war crimes from the Zio Americans, that'll be changing soon. And now it's who's got greater strategic depth, right? Like who can rebuild faster, who can reconstitute their societies, who can survive the coming dark days that are probably awaiting the region. I mean, we haven't seen that just yet, but I don't know. The Zionists need to escalate. That's the thing. Like they have to escalate, because the more they escalate, the more it's grist to their emotional mill, to their own people, but it also draws the US further and further into the conflict, because Iran then raises the costs for the empire. And that's what it's been doing. Literally today, as this thing has gone, probably Iran has done hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars in damage to the U.S. war machine, just in what it's doing now. Now the latest story is the IRGC. This is from a skeptical channel, so that's why they say the IRGC claims to have struck 6 American LCU. I don't know what that means, in the port of Dubai and Bandar al Shuyukh. LCU, chat. What is it? They also struck one hotel that allegedly had U.S. troops in it. Landcraft unit, I don't know, something, and achieved casualties. This was probably in response to the sinking of the Iranian fleet on the Caspian. So everyone's taking severe blows in all of this, but who's going to be better poised to rebuild? And that's clearly the Iranians. They have a rail link to the workshop of the world, right? The Israelis have the Tomato King sending trucks in. Like that's like they have no friends, they have no allies. LCU is a ship for amphibious assaults. Thank you, Chad. So yeah, that's my view of Iranian diaspora is like, stop talking about the stupid diaspora, and who cares? Like we ourselves have to cope with this fascism, like in our families, that has been cultivated. Like we have to work as a community. I keep thinking about the guy. I mean, this story got lost in all of this, but we can laugh about him now. But I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's also like so crazy. Like that guy who killed himself in Iran because Trump didn't bomb. Do you remember this story, guys? Do you remember this insane story? Some loser who had his mind poisoned so profoundly that he took his own life, but even prematurely. He just had to wait a little bit longer. Like that. Like you either laugh or cry about that. Like you laugh at the guy for being so stupid.
Compare that to Aaron Bushnell.
Yes, exactly. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Geez, they just attacked Bushehr power plant again. These people are crazy, man. These people are crazy.
That's the nuclear power plant. Yeah,
that's being
a reactor
co-built with the Russians are building it with them.
Yeah,
and yeah.
Well, okay. Well, we will catch up with more, on this, but I think this is a good place. I wanted to ask you about the diaspora, if only because we keep hearing from people who are well-meaning, but that, to listen to Iranian voices, but so many of the voices come from these sorts of sources. So my rejoinder to that would be, you now can go and in fact, actually, if you confront people who talk about this and say, well, this is what my Iranian friend says about things, is go to VPOL, site. You can find them on X and so on. Lots of excellent clips from Helia Doutari's interviews with people on the streets in Iran at these, spontaneous rallies that just started every night since the first day after the assassination of the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and they've been continuing since then. Find out. Please do listen to Iranian voices inside Iran and what they have to say about their situation and what kind of reasons why they are resisting and coming out with such bravery to defend their country's sovereignty. So do listen to them. And I just want to thank everybody for being here in the chat. Thanks, Sina, for coming. Producer Sina from out behind the camera, back at as East as a podcast host and guest. So we had a wonderful edition of Office Hours. That is, Adnan is a podcast and East is a show, some kind of combo thing. And it's great to have all of your comments. Please do consider supporting the Gaza, fundraiser for Mohammed and his family, his siblings. I put it into the chat again. Please do consider my hopefully future Gaza students in my class, help them cover the costs of the course. So they need internet access and those kinds of expenses so that they can take the course. And of course, if you want to support, this platform, you can. But that stuff's in the description. I'd rather you give to the Spocks for Gaza and for Muhammad and he's a young man who is responsible for his entire family, his 4 siblings who are younger. They've been orphaned. He's now responsible for them. He's a teenager, and he is trying to help his younger siblings survive this genocide in Gaza. So please do give generously to them. And thank you, Sina, for highlighting, their needs and, supporting them. My listeners, please do support them as well. And so you can find the information in the chat. I'll edit the description and put a link for them. That same link, I'll put it in the description. So if you're watching this later, you can find it more easily. There were some other wonderful kind of questions, and I would love to, have time to answer Joe's, excellent question about like the dignified comms of like the Iranian leadership, and look at that in historical perspective. All I will say is when you have 3,000 years of tradition of statecraft, you know how to do diplomacy. In a way, it was a weakness of Iran that it was so good and so used to diplomacy that they kept going into diplomacy, when in a way it's clear they just needed to keep, and thankfully they just kept building the missiles. But some of the times the diplomacy has been, a problem for them, that they have enthusiastically engaged it without any genuine, expectation that these would lead to anything. And so, but the reason why they have such dignified, kind of presence is they are used to leadership and governance in a society and a culture that has been doing this and been a leader in this for many thousands of years. So anyway, you can listen to my Rev Left radio interview where I talked with Brett O'Shea about this kind of longer, deeper history. And it's also on my channel, at least in audio. So not on YouTube, but go check it out on podcast. And it's a 2-hour and 45-minute discussion about Iran's kind of deeper history and how it relates to the contemporary events. So go check that out. All right, everyone. This has been a wonderful conversation with Sina Rahmani. Go check out East as a podcast if you don't already subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you again really soon. We will have a Iran versus the Epstein Empire episode 9 very soon, maybe Monday live stream. Lots of other great content coming. I have scheduled a interview with Helia Doutaghi, who's in Iran, and Bikram Gill, favorites who appeared and had a great discussion on Sina's channel. Go check that out as well. But I look forward to talking with you again soon. Until next time, peace and solidarity to you all.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.